She didn't say a word that night. She didn't have to. The way her eyes locked on mine, steady and unflinching, it was as if she'd already decided my fate long before I understood what was happening. I remember that evening more clearly than I should. The room itself was nothing remarkable, just a gathering of friends, muted laughter spilling over soft music, glasses clinking in easy rhythm. But even before I saw her, there was something in the air, a strange current humming beneath the surface. I was leaning against the far wall, half listening to a conversation I wasn't truly a part of, when my eyes wandered across the room. That's when they found her. She wasn't trying to be the center of attention, but she carried herself as if the space had quietly rearranged itself to make room for her. There was a grace in the way she moved, unhurried, composed, every gesture deliberate but never forced. She was older than the women I was used to noticing, and yet that difference was the very thing that made it impossible to look away. Her hair caught the glow of the overhead light, soft waves brushing against her shoulders as she turned slightly to laugh at something someone had said. The sound didn't carry to me, but I felt it all the same, like warmth reaching across the space between us. Then, she looked up. It wasn't the kind of fleeting eye contact people exchange in crowded rooms. No, her gaze settled on me and held steady, as if she'd been waiting for the exact moment I'd notice her. My chest tightened, an involuntary reaction, like my body understood something long before my mind caught up. There was nothing dramatic in her expression, just the faintest curve at the corner of her lips, the calm steadiness of her eyes. But somehow, that subtlety was more disarming than anything else. It was as though she'd already decided something about me, something I hadn't even considered for myself. I tried to look away. I told myself it was polite, that holding her gaze any longer would be too obvious. But the truth was, I couldn't. The room around me blurred. The voices dulled. All I saw was the way she tilted her head slightly, like she was reading a story written across my face. And the longer she looked, the more it felt like she knew how it ended. I shifted my weight, trying to ground myself, but my chest betrayed me. Every breath uneven, shallow. It wasn't desire in the way people usually mean it. It was something heavier, something that pressed into me and whispered that nothing would be the same after this moment. And when she finally looked away, I found myself almost grateful and disappointed all at once. Grateful for the space to breathe again, and disappointed because I already knew I would spend the rest of the night searching for her eyes in every corner of that room. She didn't speak to me then. She didn't need to. That one look had been enough. Enough to unsettle me. Enough to pull me out of myself. Enough to make me wonder if, somehow, my fate had been decided before I even knew I was playing a part in it. Later in the evening, I found myself drifting toward the quieter edge of the gathering, the kind of place where the music softened into background hum, and the laughter from the center of the room came muffled, almost distant. I wasn't surprised when I saw her there. Somehow, I already knew she wouldn't linger in the spotlight for long. She stood near a tall window, the pale glow of the street lamps outside tracing her profile. There was a steadiness in her posture, one hand loosely wrapped around the stem of her glass, the other resting gently against the window frame. She looked completely at ease, yet her presence seemed to draw the air around her into stillness. I hesitated, half of me certain I shouldn't intrude, the other half unable to resist. My footsteps carried me closer before my mind could catch up, and when she turned her head slightly, her eyes caught mine again. That same steady gaze, calm and sure, like she had expected me to arrive. "You don't seem the type to enjoy the noise," she said softly. Her voice surprised me. Not its sound. It was smooth, low, with a warmth that settled over me like velvet, but the fact that she spoke to me first. "I suppose I'm not," I admitted, offering a faint smile. "You either?" She tilted her head, a subtle acknowledgement, and then looked back toward the window, as if considering how much of herself she wanted to reveal. Crowds have their purpose, but I've always preferred conversations that don't get lost in the volume. Her words weren't sharp, but they carried weight. It felt like she was telling me something more than what she said, something about who she was. I found myself studying the way she moved, the deliberate calm of her gestures. When she lifted her glass to her lips, the soft clink as it touched them seemed louder than it should have been, pulling my attention to details I shouldn't have noticed: the faint color of her lipstick, the curve of her mouth, the way her eyes lingered on mine even as she drank. We talked about nothing at first: travel, books, the kind of small talk that usually drifts away and leaves nothing behind. But with her, it didn't feel empty. Every pause in her sentences seemed intentional, every look a thread pulling me further into her orbit. At one point, she leaned in slightly to emphasize a thought, and the edge of her shoulder brushed against my arm. The touch was so light, it could have been accidental. But I knew it wasn't. I felt it ripple through me, a spark traveling farther than it had any right to. I tried to keep my composure, nodding, responding, laughing in the right places. But inside, everything was shifting. It was as though she was testing how close she could stand before I lost the ability to think clearly. And the truth was, I already had. The room behind us carried on, oblivious, while the two of us stood cocooned in a corner that felt removed from everything else. It was just her voice, her gaze, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the cool draft from the window. And I realized then, this wasn't chance. She wasn't simply making conversation. She was drawing me in, piece by piece, with a quiet certainty I couldn't resist. After a while, the air inside began to feel heavy, thick with laughter and overlapping conversations. She glanced toward the door, then back at me, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "Shall we get some air?" she asked, not really asking. I nodded, almost too quickly, and followed her as she moved through the room. People stepped aside without realizing it, as though her presence created a quiet path through the crowd. When we stepped outside, the sudden coolness of the night wrapped around us, sharp and refreshing after the warmth of the house. The world felt softer there. The street lamps glowed a muted amber, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Crickets hummed faintly in the distance, and the air carried that faint, earthy scent that always lingers after dusk. We walked side by side along the narrow path that edged the garden. For a while, neither of us spoke. But it wasn't the kind of silence that needed filling. It was easy, natural, like we both knew words would only break something delicate that had begun to take shape between us. Her heels clicked gently against the stones, a sound steady enough to anchor me. She held her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders, her hands brushing against the fabric as she adjusted it. There was something striking about that small, almost absent-minded movement. Without thinking, I slipped off my jacket. "Here," I said softly, holding it out. She stopped walking and turned toward me, the light catching her eyes in a way that made them look deeper, darker. For a moment, she didn't take it. She just looked at me, studying my face as though searching for proof of something unspoken. Then, slowly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against mine as she took the jacket, barely a touch, just the softest graze of skin against skin. But it was enough. Enough to leave warmth burning across my hand long after she let go. She slid the jacket around her shoulders, pulling it close, and I could almost feel the lingering imprint of her touch through the night air. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice carried a weight that made the words feel heavier than simple courtesy. We kept walking, our steps falling into quiet rhythm. The garden stretched out before us, shadows shifting gently with the breeze. Every now and then, her hand would swing close to mine, not quite touching, just near enough to make me aware of the space between us. That small, invisible thread pulled tighter with every step. At one point, she slowed, turning her face slightly toward the stars. Her profile was outlined by the lamplight, serene yet unguarded, as though she had allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. And I realized I was holding my breath, not because the night was cold, not because of the silence, but because I didn't want to break the spell of that moment. It wasn't just a walk. It was a crossing of lines. Lines I had never thought I'd approach. And yet, standing there with her wrapped in my jacket, I knew there was no turning back. We drifted back toward the house eventually, though neither of us seemed in a hurry. The porch light spilled across the wooden steps, warm but dim, casting long shadows that stretched into the night. I leaned lightly against the railing, and she stood just a little apart, her arms folded loosely around herself, my jacket still draped across her shoulders. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The muffled hum of conversation carried faintly from inside, but out here, it felt like we had slipped into a separate world, one where time moved differently. I found myself watching her more closely than I should have. The way she held herself, calm and unshaken, like she was used to being the one who steadied others. And yet, in the subtle set of her shoulders, I thought I saw something else too. Something quiet, almost fragile. That's when the weight of it all began to settle on me. The difference between us, the questions I knew would come if anyone looked too closely. I could already imagine the voices. She's too old for you. What are you doing? It will never last. But then there was her, standing there with that same quiet confidence, her eyes resting on me as though none of those things mattered, as though she had already decided what we were, long before I had even dared to name it. When her gaze met mine, it was steady, unwavering. I felt exposed under it, like she could see past every hesitation, every excuse, down to the truth I was trying to ignore. You're overthinking, she said softly. I blinked, caught off guard. Am I that obvious? Her lips curved, the faintest smile, not mocking but knowing. Only to someone who's looking closely. The words hung between us, heavier than they should have been. It wasn't a playful remark. It was a confession in disguise. She was looking closely. She had been, from the very start. I swallowed, trying to find something to say, but nothing came. The silence pressed in again, thick with meaning. And then, as if to cut through it, she stepped closer, just one step, small, deliberate. The space between us shrank, and with it, the air grew sharper. I could see the faint rise and fall of her breath, could almost feel the warmth radiating from her even in the cool night. Her eyes didn't waver. They searched mine, lingering with an intensity that made my pulse unsteady. It felt like she was waiting, for me to admit what I wanted, for me to acknowledge what she already knew. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The weight pressing down on me wasn't just about the world outside or the differences we carried. It was the weight of inevitability. The sense that this, whatever this was no longer something I could walk away from. Her gaze softened slightly, the smallest shift, but it was enough to undo me. Because in it, I saw not just certainty, but patience. She wasn't demanding anything. She was simply waiting for me to catch up to the decision she had already made. And I wasn't sure I could resist. The night seemed to grow quieter around us, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I could feel the weight of her nearness, the invisible pull that had been building since that first glance across the room. I should have said goodbye. That would have been the sensible thing, to step back, to leave while the moment was still harmless. But I didn't move. Neither did she. Instead, she let her eyes drift downward, to where my hand rested against the railing. Slowly, she reached out, brushing an invisible speck of dust from the sleeve of my shirt. It was the smallest gesture, something ordinary, almost forgettable. But the way she did it, there was no rush, no detachment. Her fingertips lingered against the fabric, tracing lightly as though memorizing the shape of my arm beneath. The warmth of her touch seeped through the cotton, a quiet fire spreading across my skin, settling into me with a weight that made my chest tighten. I couldn't breathe evenly. My pulse betrayed me, thrumming against my wrist where her hand had come close. I forced myself not to flinch, not to pull away, not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted the opposite. I wanted that touch to last. She looked up at me then, her hand still resting lightly against my sleeve. Her expression wasn't bold, not overtly suggestive. It was calmer than that, deeper, as though she was asking me if I understood what this meant, if I was willing to step into the space she was quietly opening for me. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. All I managed was a half-breath, a small shake of my head, though I wasn't saying no. I was only admitting how undone I felt beneath her gaze. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, and her hand slid just a fraction lower, until her fingers brushed against the inside of my wrist. The contact was barely there, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. My heart stuttered, loud in my chest, as if it wanted her to feel it. That single touch carried more weight than any embrace I had ever known. It wasn't loud, wasn't demanding. It was quiet, deliberate, and yet it held the promise of something larger, something that scared me as much as it pulled me in. I looked down at her hand, then back up into her eyes. The world around us dissolved. No porch light, no distant laughter from inside, no hum of the night. Just her, standing there in my jacket, her hand resting against me as though it had always belonged there. I didn't move. I couldn't, because I knew the second I shifted, that moment would end, and I wasn't ready to let it go. The truth was simple, undeniable. I had already surrendered to her. Not with words, not with declarations, but with the way I let her hand linger, the way I leaned into her touch without realizing it. It wasn't just a touch. It was a choice, and it was one I knew I would carry long after she finally let go. Time seemed to slow after that. Her hand still rested lightly on my sleeve, her fingers grazing against the inside of my wrist, and I realized I hadn't taken a full breath in what felt like minutes. I thought she might say something to acknowledge what had just passed between us. But she didn't. She didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than words ever could. I lifted my eyes to hers, and what I found there unsettled me more than anything she could have confessed aloud. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no trace of doubt. She was looking at me as if she had already decided, as if she was only waiting for me to recognize it for myself. I opened my mouth once, then closed it again. What could I possibly say? Words felt clumsy, inadequate, too fragile to hold the weight of this moment. She didn't move closer, not quite. Instead, she allowed the air between us to thin, to charge with something that made my skin prickle. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing, steady but soft, and for some reason, that detail undid me more than anything else. The simple intimacy of being near enough to feel her presence, to sense her warmth. Her eyes softened, the corners tightening as though she wanted to smile, but thought better of it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she tilted her head, just slightly. Not enough to bridge the distance, but enough to suggest she would if I let her. My chest constricted. I could feel the weight of choice pressing against me. Step forward and let everything change, or step back and pretend the last hour hadn't shifted the ground beneath us. But I didn't step back. I didn't move at all. And in that stillness, I realized something important. This wasn't about her asking. This wasn't about permission or pursuit. This was about inevitability. About her knowing before I did where this would lead. I felt my hand twitch against the railing, aching to close the space, aching to take hers and hold it. But even without the gesture, the truth was already there. We both knew it. Her breath shivered on the cool night air. My pulse thudded unevenly, and in the space between us, something shifted, wordless but undeniable. She didn't kiss me. I didn't kiss her. Yet in that moment, it felt as though we had confessed everything, without sound, without touch, only with the quiet honesty in our eyes. Her gaze told me she trusted me to understand, and mine told her I did. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't fiery. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement, a surrender to the pull neither of us could resist. And though no words were spoken, I knew then that I belonged to her. Not someday, not eventually. Now. The silence stretched on, and for a while, it felt as if the night itself had leaned in to listen. Neither of us spoke, neither of us moved, but everything had already been said in the weight of her gaze, in the unspoken truth pulsing between us. Finally, she drew a slow breath and let it out, almost like she was releasing the last of her hesitation. Her hand slipped from my sleeve, but instead of falling away, it shifted, rising to rest gently against my chest. The touch was feather-light at first, just the flat of her palm pressing over my heartbeat. But that was enough. I felt the warmth of her skin seeping through the thin fabric, steadying me even as my pulse raced beneath her fingers. I stood frozen, not because I wanted to resist, but because I didn't want to break whatever delicate thread held us in place. Her eyes softened as she looked up at me, and then, with a quiet certainty, she stepped forward until the space between us disappeared. Her forehead rested lightly against my chest, the crown of her head brushing beneath my chin. It was such a simple gesture, so tender, so unassuming, but it undid me more completely than any kiss could have. My arms moved almost on their own, wrapping around her shoulders, drawing her against me. She melted into the embrace with a kind of calm that made me realize she had been waiting for this, perhaps from the very first moment she looked at me. I let my chin rest against her hair, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume. Floral, subtle, something that would linger in my memory long after tonight. The rhythm of her breath matched mine, slow and even now, as if the storm of tension between us had finally broken into something steady, something real. For a long moment, we just stood there. No words, no movement, just a quiet exchange of warmth, heartbeat against heartbeat, silence heavy but comforting. And in that stillness, I understood she hadn't been asking me to choose. She had already chosen long before I realized it. That look she gave me across the room, the one that left me unsettled and breathless, this was the fate she had already decided. I tightened my arms around her just slightly, not wanting to let go. And when she shifted enough to glance up at me, her eyes carried the faintest shimmer, a mixture of strength and vulnerability that made my chest ache. No promises were spoken that night. No declarations were made. But there, in the quiet embrace beneath the porch light, I knew my life had changed. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in a steady gaze, in a hand that lingers too long, in the silent decision of someone who sees you more clearly than you see yourself. And from the moment she looked at me that night, I think she knew all along my fate had already been sealed.